Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Hi, Ann. How are you guys doing in all of the storms?
Pretty good. It's just I joke that my pool now looks like an infinity pool.
Does it just stretch across the whole yard now?
Nah, not exactly. The water is at the very, very top.
Oh no.
Not too bad. We've been pretty lucky.
Seems like we just can't get it to stop.
I know. And the weeds just keep growing. That's my big, that and the dog loves the mud.
For me, the trash just keeps going everywhere. There's no way. There's no way to clean up. It's all wet and soggy now, too.
Yeah, yeah. But last night at 10:30, my old dog decided to have a fence fight with the neighbor's dog, which is where all the water and the mud is.
Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah, they like to bark and jump at the fence at each other and pretend to fight. It's kind of stupid.
I bet that was fun to clean up.
Yeah, that was fun. Especially since my old dog, she has a hard time. Like if you pick up one of her feet, she like wants to collapse under the weight of like not having all 4 feet on the ground. It's sad. She's 12, big old Labrador.
Oh wow.
So what time, or we're not live yet with the whole public thing, right?
We're live on YouTube, but we're not recording yet. Hi, everyone.
Happy Friday, folks.
Happy Friday.
Morning.
Eric and Flozell, we can kick off whenever you guys are ready, or we can wait a few more minutes in case we have stragglers.
Yeah, I was wondering if we need quorum to actually get through the agenda or not.
We don't need a quorum, so we can start whenever, but I do see a few members trickling on, so we can wait till they join.
Second, and then we'll. Why don't we get started? Dr. Calavota, do you want to get us started with, well, we'll call the meeting to order and ask Lindsay to do roll call, and then we'll do some welcoming remarks.
Sure, certainly. Flozell Daniels.
Here.
Dr. Eric Calavoda.
Here.
Vivian Johnson. I see Vivian's hand raised. Dr. Bethany Stish.
Here.
Hi, Bethany. Dr. Vijay Gopu. I see Dr. Gopu.
Here.
Great to see you. Chet Chasson. I know Chet might be joining us a little late today. Scott Gamble. Don't see Scott. Wiley Guilfoyle.
Here.
Hi, Wiley. Kent
Hello.
Rogers. Don't see Kent. Nira Washington.
Present.
TJ Nira. Jessica Kemp.
Here.
Hi, Jessica. Ann Vale.
Here.
Joe Inati. I don't see Joe. Alex Pazorski.
Here.
And Harriet Turgoni. Nice to see Harriet. Hey, Harriet. And chairs, we do have a quorum of members.
Fantastic. Eric, do you want to get started with any remarks or any?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning, too. This is kind of an important meeting here. It's the last one we're going to have as a committee for a while going forward. We do have quite a few recommendations. We did get a few. I was worried toward the end there that we weren't going to have very many, but they came flowing in right at the last minute. And so consequently, there's a lot of them that are similar and they're of sort of the same general strategy. And so we think we've got them grouped properly into some strategy categories. And that's, I think, what we're going to review today and talk about that and see if there's any gaps or things like that. So anyway, should be a good meeting. And I thank everybody for spending their Friday morning with us. I think you'll find it productive and worthwhile.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. And I'll just add a tremendous thank you to everyone, both the committee members, some outstanding work by the staff and the interested public who've been tracking increasingly the work of both this committee as well as the task force, and folks have really stepped up to do the work of recommending these actions. To Eric's point, there's some amazing actions recommended. We see lots of alignment across the different committees, which is exciting because that means we might be able to leverage each other's ideas and work. And what's been recommended is, I think, exactly what's needed to push us forward. I'm not sure how many of you saw the unveiling of the Ford F-150 electric truck. Yeah, I think it was yesterday, maybe. And I can't tell you if you had said to me 6 months ago there'd ever be such a thing. I would have been able to imagine it. And Bill Ford said something I thought was interesting. He said, it's time for us to stop thinking about the future and start acting today. And I really feel like the work of this task force and this committee is thinking a lot about what it means to be proactive and to step forward with some bold and effective ideas. So thanks to everybody. It looks, Lindsay, like we have the approval of the minutes.
Yes, members, you should have all received in the calendar invitation yesterday the meeting minutes. And chairs, if I can just ask you to make a motion to approve those from the last meeting.
So moved. Is there a second?
A second.
I'll second it. Or
Great, thanks, Ann.
I was on mute when I first tried.
No problem. Are there any corrections, additions, or any other comments on the minutes? Are there any opposed? Seeing no opposition, the minutes are approved. Thank you all. And Lindsay, we're going to turn it over to you for actions overview.
Wonderful. Thank you to both of our chairs for welcoming us this morning. And just to note for our members, Kent Rogers has joined us. Great to see you this morning, Kent. And Harriet noted that the attachments might have disappeared from the calendar invitation. So I just resent you guys the actions for the committee that were received in that spreadsheet form so that you can look through them as we go through our discussion today. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And just to kick us off this morning, I'll walk us through a brief presentation just on where we are in the process of action development, but also we have some of our advisory groups that have been working on and will continue to be working on the evaluation side. So I want you guys to know, as Eric mentioned, we won't meet for a while. So where are actions going next? So I'll just tee that up a little bit, and we'll spend most of our time in a working session today, really thinking through those sector actions that you guys all put forward, and that members of the public did as well. So really the desired outcomes for this meeting is to give some time for this committee to discuss together the body of action proposals that were received relating to transportation from all of you, and also from members of the task force and other groups and the public as well. A lot of great cross-disciplinary actions also that you guys will review, and that other groups will also provide a different lens on. And having the opportunity just to highlight some interesting ideas. Where do we need to focus further attention or further areas of study? Where can we begin to gap fill and organize and refine and improve actions? So as we move forward, our governor's office team will be taking the lead on refining and gap filling and moving forward these actions from here. But we'll be leaning on the expertise of you all as committee members over the next couple months as we begin to do that. So our hope from the discussion today is that we can lean on your collective perspective, your experience, your expertise on this initial take as we begin to process through all these actions. So I'll kick us off, as I mentioned today, with just some table setting of where we are in the process, and then we'll spend most of the time on our discussion. I'd also like to welcome Colleen McHugh from the Water Institute, who's on this call, who will just be helping us with taking notes and keeping our discussion on track. And that way we can send out to you guys after the meeting any notes and any follow-ups that we need to have after this discussion. So I just want to start again by grounding us in where we are in the overall planning process. We're moving forward slowly but surely over the past 6 months, and now we're in steps 3 and 4 of our process. And so the role of sector committees has been primarily focused in that 3rd step of identifying alternatives. So in this case, what are the different strategies and actions that we can use to reduce emissions in Louisiana? And at the same time that you guys have been working in that 3rd step, the advisory groups have been beginning to forecast consequences of those high-level strategies against our fundamental objectives that we worked through in the first couple meetings of this group and the task force as a whole in that 2nd step. So they're beginning to understand potential positive and negative outcomes of those high-level strategies. So we're working at those 2 different scales right now. And to highlight this 3rd step on the alternatives, through that action development process, by that April 30th deadline, we received 169 actions. And you guys in transportation received 36 alone, which is, as Eric mentioned, pretty incredible. You guys put forward some wonderful ideas. And we are having multiple groups review the same proposals. So you all in transportation are reviewing some actions that the land use group will also review, and some that can be applied to cross-sector lenses. And so we want to ensure that there's that cross-disciplinary review of actions. So all of the committees don't add up to 170. So we're really expanding who is reviewing which actions in that. And just to bring us to the 4th step of our process, where the advisory groups have been working, I just wanted to shift gears to talk about what they've been up to, since this relates to where actions will go moving forward. So focusing in this 4th step of our process, we're doing 2 rounds of what we're calling consequence analysis or evaluation in this process. And they're focused on different level of details in these 2 rounds of analysis. And so as we mentioned before, this process requires both that high-level vision and then the practical action. So as you guys remember, in that March meeting, we first talked about strategies, those high-level pathways to reach and reduce emissions. And then that helped lead us into that discussion on actions. So we took some of those recommendations that you guys provided on strategies and organized them into these big picture hypothetical views of a future for Louisiana in these different portfolio scenarios. And so we're taking that high level look in the first round of evaluation. But as we move forward into a 2nd round of evaluation, as you see on the right side of the screen, we're bringing in those granular actions. So we'll still have the high level strategies in the evaluation, but there will be actions to really identify and further refine out what we really mean through the strategies. So in the action portfolios, the second round in the summer, in the late summertime, is when the work that you guys have been doing on the action scale will come into this higher level evaluation. So in both of these rounds of evaluation, we're evaluating against those 18 fundamental objectives that we identified from collective input throughout the first few months of the process. So this includes our objectives on net greenhouse gas emission reduction, but also includes our objectives on quality of life, equity, economy, environment, resilience, short and long-term success. So we're taking that real holistic approach in how we're evaluating and prioritizing our actions and strategies moving forward. Just to dive into this first round of evaluation that we've been doing right now, these are the 5 themes that we have organized the strategies underneath. So the first portfolio was a business as usual case, and that it was aimed at understanding the consequences of inaction. So how does inaction impact our 18 fundamental objectives? And then the other 4 portfolios represent these extreme alternatives and approaches, and that's why we're calling them hypothetical portfolios, because we're really turning the dial all the way up on specific kinds of strategies. So you can see here, there's one on intensive electrification through zero carbon renewable. So what happens if we turn that all the way up? And how does that impact our objectives? What kind of emission reduction potential does that have? But also, how does it impact the other things that we've deemed important in this effort? And then the same for reduced demand, consumption, and waste, and then industrial carbon removal, capture, use, and storage, and then natural sequestration and sinks as well. So the purpose of this exercise is not to have the task force pick one of the portfolios. We know that we need some combination of a lot of different approaches to reach net zero. So rather, we're using this exercise to understand the bigger picture implications of these different approaches to reducing emissions and setting priorities in our summer task force meetings from that. So this will also help us as we begin to work in refining actions and as we approach that second round of evaluation in the summer when we're including those actions within them. So I know a big question that we've been asked is, how are we getting from these 169 proposals to eventually those action portfolios in the summertime, and then eventually to our final climate plan? So I just wanted to walk through these steps of the process with you guys on how far we've made it so far, and then also where we're going next. So we have that in mind today as we start our discussion. So we can check off these first 2 steps of the process of submitting action proposals and having them posted publicly. And today we're in this 3rd step of sorting proposals into the sector and themes and discussing them in committees today. And then as we're looking to the right, we'll provide a report out to the task force in their June 8th meeting on all action proposals received. We do really want to focus their feedback on those cross-sector and economy-wide actions, but reporting out on the work that you guys have done at the committee level on the actions we've produced, and then the work that we've done in these May meetings as well. And then if we look all the way to the top right, we'll closely review those actions as we're moving forward to organize and combine them and begin to gap fill and group strategies as we think it makes sense to put together a comprehensive plan. So we know that a lot of actions might span a few sectors, or they might cross those traditionally sectoral boundaries. So we want to make sure we're working together, that these sectors are speaking to each other. So that's why our team, as the governor's office, will be taking the lead on that, since we've been in all of the conversations, and we can provide that cross-disciplinary review. And if we're looking to the bottom right, we'll then organize all the actions and strategies, as I mentioned, into those portfolios that include actions within the strategies. If we're moving along the bottom to the left, where that plus minus sign is, then the advisory groups will do that evaluation against fundamental objectives. And you guys will meet again in September in this 3rd to last step to have an opportunity to revise actions based on feedback from advisory groups. So the advisory groups will provide the evaluation, and then you all can come back together to have that last pass at revisions before this moves forward to the task force to make those final decisions in the last 2 steps. So that's where we are today, and then that's where we're moving forward on looking ahead to that September meeting that you guys will have. Just to put that in context of our timeline, as I mentioned, the red boxes show where your meetings will happen in late May, which is our meeting today, and then in September coming back to review based on feedback from advisory groups. And then from there, as you can see, as we get into the later part of 2021, it will really, with the task force making some of those challenging decisions and moving forward with the actions and strategies then. And that was the background and process that I wanted to provide for you guys before we jump into the action proposals. But just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions on the process components before we move forward.
Lindsay, let me ask, I see that the inventory is scheduled to be presented in August. So do we feel like we're still on schedule for that milestone, or how are we doing on that front?
The inventory will be presented at that July 29th task force meeting. So we are still on track to have that presented to you guys then.
And is there an expectation that will be one of the primary sources of, or a resource to help test whether the actions are going to get us where we're trying to go?
We're using and I can share this presentation with you guys that we had from the Energy Innovation Group that developed this energy policy simulator. And just for the awareness of our members, that tool will help us plug in specific actions and estimate their emission reduction potential in Louisiana. So they're developing a tool specifically for Louisiana. They've done this for other states as well. It's an open source tool, so once we get that off the ground, we'll share that with you guys. But they're actually working from federal level data scaled down to Louisiana. And Colleen might know the sources of data better than I do. I know it's EIA and a few national analyses that they're scaling down to Louisiana. But the inventory will almost be used as a check on that data to ensure that that's accurate in Louisiana. So it's not that it will just rely on the inventory. It's mainly relying on these federally sourced data sets. But the inventory will just provide that Louisiana specific lens.
That's useful. Thank you. Harriet, do you have a question?
I do. So actually a few questions, and I apologize if everyone understands this but me. So as someone who submitted proposals, I wasn't complete in my proposal. I didn't have all of the answers to all of the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to be winnowing and combining any of the actions that are in front of us today? What about that additional information that was requested in the template, but that may not have been filled out? And this now is not the appropriate time, but at some point I'd wanted to draw some parallels between this administration's American Jobs Plan and this particular effort, mm-hmm. and how some of the work of this overall climate task force would maybe enable Louisiana to better compete for any grants, discretionary grants coming out of the federal government, and how we might want to explicitly try to acknowledge that. We can talk about that later, but yeah.
That's a great question. Well, those are all great questions to raise, Harriet. And actually a point that I had wanted to ask you about in our discussion today is on how do we coordinate and work with those federal programs, especially the American Jobs Plan that is launching at the federal level and other programs as well. So certainly as we move forward, that actually builds well on an action idea that Flozell put forward that I'd love for us to discuss. From the perspective of where we're going with actions, we don't intend that we'll put a full action template in our climate plan. The reason we've asked for those more specific impacts and implementation pathways is so when we do publish our plan, when our plan is approved, that we can hit the ground running with implementation steps, but entirely understand and did not expect anyone to have every question answered on that template. Those are great discussion points that we can bring up today too. So I'll run through just at a high level the actions that were received, and as we go back through them and dive into discussion, it would be great for you guys to even raise questions that you still have or places that would be helpful for us to look at further resources, or maybe other committee members can help with that too. So today's a great point to bring that up. But again, no expectation that every question is answered.
Great. Let's see, are there any other questions or points of clarity we'd like Lindsay to respond to before we move on? And there's also a great discussion in the chat here about the energy policy solutions toolkit that is apparently in beta form. All right, Lindsay, let's move forward.
For those questions, just to take a high level at the actions that were received, as I mentioned, we brought them back under some of these high level strategies just to organize our discussion for today. So we're going to talk through public transit service, land use planning, energy efficiency and reduced trips, alternative fuel and EV charging, and then transitioning vehicles and public fleets. There were a lot of great actions around that, and then sequestering transportation sector emissions. So if we take just an initial glance at these first two strategies of increasing public transit service and then land use planning, we had a lot of actions here around increasing access to resources outside of urban centers. I think they build well on each other, the public transit, the need to increase public transit, and then enhancing our land use planning as well. And a big question that I have on actions on this slide for you all is just how do we make this happen? How do we operationalize this? Is this additional authority to our MPOs or to our state agencies? And how can we begin to operationalize some of this? So around the land use planning, we had action ideas on how do we link land use and transportation planning through an authority that manages land use patterns, compact development, and complete streets, as well as reducing vehicle miles traveled. If we move forward to promoting energy efficiency and reduced trips, we had a few actions around reducing idling of vehicles. Eric and the DOTD team put forward some actions on reducing travel, carpool, congestion reduction programs, and energy conservation as well. So Eric and Connie, it would be great to hear from you guys on some of those actions put forward. And there was also an action here from a member of our land use committee on creating a Buy Clean Louisiana policy. So encouraging that we would use low carbon intensity materials. An area I thought that was applicable in transportation is around concrete, using low carbon intense concrete. And then an action also around freight low carbon mode shift to encourage freights using most efficient methods. And so something that I would like you guys to think about on efficiency and reduced trips is, do we need to bring more focus to medium and heavy duty vehicles in this category? Can we promote reduced idling of freight trucks or non-public fleets? How do we make these a little bit more comprehensive in all of our vehicles? As we're looking to increase alternative fuel and EV charging availability, a lot of great actions from you guys on in this, and I'd love to hear from the few actions that you put forward in this group as well. So a big question I have here is on what alternative fuels should be used when. It'd be great to have a discussion from you guys around what fuels can be used, how do we expand, how do we utilize the EV charging infrastructure that exists, and then how do we expand that as well. And then as we, on our last slide of transitioning vehicles and public fleets, this is a great place in Flo's action where he speaks to outreach and education regarding shifts of green transition. Harriet, that would be a great place to hear more of your ideas on the American Jobs Plan and ideas put forward there. And then also some action items on the the state fleet, converting the fleet to alternative fuels and to electric zero emission vehicle requirements. And then Harriet had a great proposal on school bus electrification. So we can come back to some of those overarching ideas as well. And then the last two action items that Eric had put forward are in regard to sequestering transportation emissions through first natural sequestration and then carbon capture and storage. So Eric will have you expand some on those ideas when we come back to this strategy. So I'll back us up to this first slide of increasing public transit service and enhancing land use planning. So I would first be interested to hear from you guys if there are any actions in here you find particularly interesting. If you put forward some ideas, we would love to hear you expand on the action items that you set forth. And then my last question would be on just what are we missing in this category? Are there any gaps that we can plug while we're in here? So with that, I see Alex's hand is raised, and I'll then pass it to our chairs if they have any comments to the discussion.
Well, yeah, I can just briefly talk about the action that I put out there. I think we've had conversation about how to, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the transportation sector. A large percentage is single occupancy vehicle, and we've had a lot of conversation about how to shift to make it more likely for folks to take transit. In a lot of research that I did for this action, the literature is pretty consistent. Transit service is considered, an elastic good, a good that more people will use it when the price is lower, less people will use it when the price is higher. And the concept of the amount of time it takes people to get somewhere is considered a cost in this instance. So there's just a lot of consistency in the literature over a number of decades that the more service that is available for people, the more reliable and frequent transit service is, the more people are going to take transit. So to be able to get that mode shift, even a relatively modest mode shift, we were looking at a 1% mode shift, you need to be able to put more service out on the street. Issue there is that our transit agencies are doing a lot right now with very little. So trying to find areas where you can support more, where you can find more support for operations funding for transit agencies is going to be critical to be able to do that. So I put together basically a rough sketch for our 4 largest transit agencies, which is where you're really going to be able to see that mode shift in the places where you've already got ridership, you've already got more of a land use pattern that's going to support transit. And again, rough back of the envelope, but looking at about $61 million additionally on an annual basis in terms of operation. And within that action proposed a couple of areas where that could come from. The first one that I think is very important for this body to consider is increased state funding via the Parish Transportation Fund, the Mass Transit account, which right now is about $5 million annually for our major transit agencies. There's also a handful of additional actions that I have a little bit less of a basis on, but would like to explore further. Certainly, there's a lot of federal funding for transit, but for the most part, it's only available for capital projects. And there's a lot of conversation right now about how do we shift some of that around so transit agencies have the ability to use that for their operations as well on an annual basis. So just making a statement and increasing statewide conversation and pressure on that would be important. Increasing rural transportation. From talking with Eric, I understand we have sort of a ready to go rural transit plan. It just requires the go ahead with funding for that. And then finally, looking a little bit deeper into how easy or difficult it is for localities just to put additional ballot measures out there so they can find the funding. From talking with some folks, that seems to be a challenge in some areas. So that's as briefly as I can summarize it, but I do think if we want to make that mode share shift, it's not about bells and whistles for transit or having deep conversations. Well, why won't people take? It's about providing the service that makes sense for more people to take transit, makes it a logical choice for them.
If I could just comment on that too. Number one, I think Alex did a very good job with his write-up, and I think it's very reasonable, and the costs are within the range that I think that we could reasonably expect to try to get. His estimate on the 1% ridership was for the whole state. It obviously it'd be higher than that in the big urban areas. It's going to be lower. You know, you're not going to get a shift, a big shift in a place like Alexandria, which is not a very big urban area. But overall, for the whole state, 1% VMT is a lot, and to a reduction just from you know, from a shift to transit. So that's a pretty good impact. And so anyway, I just think Alex did a good job with that, and I appreciate his work on that.
Yeah, I wonder, Alex, do we know if the economic development or the business advisory group is looking at this? Because, you know, it also makes me think a lot about the access to jobs and other things that stimulate the economy, like higher education and things of that nature. And so there might be some cross-reference points that we can make to support the action.
I think that's absolutely a good avenue to look. I think there's also obviously a whole lot of equity reasons for increasing transit. In the limited amount of time I had to really dive deep into this, it was really just looking specifically at that mode share shift from the climate perspective. But I think trying to find that cross-sectoral angle is a really good idea.
Yeah, and to Dr. Calavoda's point about the rural planning, you know, I wonder if there's also an opportunity for us to start to think about regional transportation connections that allow us to take advantage. If we can get more investment in the urban side, and we have a plan for the rural, and if we can get funding for it, it seems to me that there could be some regional connections that make it a much more realistic proposition to consider.
Well, just for everybody's edification, just to let you know, the one area where we leave federal funds on the table every year is in rural operating assistance. Because the federal government will pay 50% of the operating cost for rural transit. But the problem is the state doesn't have any program to contribute to that. So local governments have to come up with the other 50%. And that's very difficult for a lot of rural areas to do because their tax base is low. So consequently, we have a number of parishes that have no public transit system at all, and a few that don't even have elderly and handicap service. So it's one thing we've been trying for years is to be able to get some state money so that we could provide 25% of the operating cost, the federal government 50%, and then local governments 25%. We think we could get a transit system, at least in every parish, operating with that kind of funding. And we could draw in another $5 to $6 million a year in federal funding, federal operating assistance, which is, I believe, about what we leave on the table every year.
Yeah, it's a big equity issue as well. So I think there's something really important about that. Thanks, Eric, for sharing that detail. Harriet, do you have your hand up?
I do, thanks. Several comments on this point. I don't know if this is something Louisiana would ever consider, but we're just emerging from a moment where employers ended up having a lot more influence and impact on travel because of decisions they made about whether people could work from home. In some places around the country, there are fairly strong travel demand management programs that essentially require employers to contribute. In many cases, that means transit funding for their workers, if that's applicable. It might mean work from home policies. It might mean other kinds of subsidies for transportation, bike subsidies, or incentives to carpool. I don't know if that's something that could be on the table in Louisiana, but these TDM programs have been very successful. They also are seen by many as a competitive advantage that if you're providing these benefits to employees, that makes it easier to attract and retain them. So anyway, something to think about there. On the rural travel, one of the moments that we're also in is technology enabled transportation, where we could run more on-demand service in rural areas. And I'll just say that there are more than 110 federal programs administered by 13 federal agencies that allow payments for transportation. The biggest, of course, is Medicaid. And that there's a lot of wasted dollars in on the medical side when people can't show up, don't show up to appointments. So there might be some things that could be cobbled together for rural communities that would enable you to get to the USDA money, but also perhaps get other kinds of federal funding. And again, if the state is paying, right, for subsidizing medical care, they have the same incentives that the federal government has to not, for people not to miss their appointments. So, there's a cost savings, admittedly a wrong pocket problem, but a cost savings there that we should absolutely be trying to look at.
Yeah, that's critically important. Thank you. And I think we're capturing some of these ideas as you all are offering them. So I really appreciate the level of detail. Kent Rogers, do you want to weigh in here?
Yes, and a couple of points. One, with the rural transit, through the MPOs across the state, there are a series of rural transit planning work being done. Some what we call it the Human Services Transportation Coordination Program. And through the years, through that effort, the biggest, I think the biggest stumbling block that we've seen is turf wars within those agencies that do provide those services. Yeah, Eric's correct. There's a lot of money left out there. But it seems to be when you propose for someone else to do something in someone else's area, they throw a fit, and that coordination does not happen. I think that there may be a bigger need to relook at who those dollars are provided to and how those dollars are provided versus the Council on Aging and Human Services and all those various different agencies that provide those services now. There's a lot of duplication that happens in some of the rural areas. But again, it comes down to some of those turf wars of one agency saying, you're not going to treat my person as well as I treat my rider, and just some of those issues. In terms of those connections between the rural and the urban areas, you're correct. Some on-demand type services to make those connections, I think, would be a great way to do that. Sportran here in our area is actually starting to do some of that, and we're actually looking at connecting more of the urban area out to the rural areas through an on-demand type of service. But again, yeah, I think there's a lot of money out there, but it's how that money is provided and where it goes to, and getting past some of those turf wars to make these things happen.
Okay. Does anybody else have comments they'd like to offer on the increased public transit service topic strategy?
Thank you for those comments, Kent. That does remind me, Danira, I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the work that you guys have done with Sportran that might be applicable in some of these actions and discussions we're having on transit ridership and access in urban areas. We might not have Danira with us at the moment.
I can tell you about some of that work that they've done. One is is he there? Okay. One is they put in a service they call Sportran on Demand. very similar to an Uber or type of service. It only provides service to certain areas. I'm getting a lot of feedback in here. Just one moment. Provide service. It's more of a connection from the urban areas out into some of the rural or more rural employment centers. And they also use that for their medical services and medical delivery, their traditional lift line type service. They use the on-demand service. They have both vans, sedans, multi-levels of cars, multi-levels of locations. So that it's a good service. I think the expansion of it, connecting more of the rural areas into the urban area would just enhance all the ridership out there.
Ken, do you know how SportTran is funded? Is that through the MPO or is that through the local or federal funding?
Can you repeat that? I'm having some feedback in here. I'm sorry.
I was curious how that program had been funded, because I know something big that we've been thinking about in public transit is just how to better utilize funds. So I was curious how SportTran was able to do that in Shreveport.
Some of that is we do transfer some of our STP 200K highway funds to them. They've also taken advantage of some of that leftover rural money that Eric was speaking of. We actually had a tip amendment for 3 different grants that they've received from different ways to, one, replace some of their existing buses, but also to help provide that service. It kind of initially grew out of their former, I'm trying to remember what the programs were called, but it slips my head for the time being, but it was basically we've used some of those rural funds, leftover rural funds, to try and provide some of that service. And then shifting some of our highway funds to transit to augment some of their other services that provides them the ability to use some of their existing funds to do that.
They also get a lot of, I mean, they get grants directly from Federal Transit Administration, but it's for capital costs. But they do get some state money now, as Alex was pointing out, through the Parish Transportation Fund, which can be used for operating. It's just not very much. It's $5 million for 13 or 12 different transit agencies right now. There may be a 13th one coming online soon, but so there's a formula for distributing that, and SportTran gets some of that, but it's not a lot, as Alex was pointing out.
That's a really interesting case study, though, for the rest of Louisiana as we're looking towards expanding public transit. Danira, I tried to unmute you. I'm not sure if that worked or not. If not, you might have to rejoin. Yes, Dr. Gopu, I see your hand.
Eric, I have a question. I think to increase the public transit usage in big cities, one of the issues is how do we get to the transit station? And unless you're within a walking distance of the transit station, it's very difficult to use the transit service. Having lived in Washington, D.C. for a few years, that's the usage of the metro system is ubiquitous because it's within a walking distance for a lot of people. And also they have some specified stations where you can park your car and then use the transit service. How do we accomplish that in, for example, in New Orleans or in Baton Rouge or Lafayette? How do we do that? I mean, that's a question I have. It's great to have the plan to increase the transit usage, but how do you do that? I mean, I'm just having a question.
Yeah, and I'll give Alex an opportunity to follow up, but just briefly, you know, we have built a number of public park and ride lots, BJ, just so you know that. And but there's also part of Alex's proposal is not just more frequent service, it's expanding the coverage area as well. And we've talked about that, about running smaller circulator buses to pick people up and bring them to the main transit lines, because you're right, if you're not within walking distance, how do you get there? And assuming some people don't have cars anyway, so even if there's a park and ride lot, they still can't get there. But with the climate we have in Louisiana, if you're walking more than about a half a mile, you don't have good access to. I mean, if I had to walk a mile in August to get on the bus, I wouldn't even want to sit next to me. So, that's not a practical thing with the climate we have here. So you have to, if you lived in San Diego or something, a mile walk might be a good thing. We'd have a much healthier population, but here that's not practical. So we're going to have circulator systems of smaller, like the little buses that you pick up, a lot of the hotels send to the airport to pick up people, the 15 passenger buses and things like that to run through the areas and gather up people and then bring them to the main transit lines. So Alex, you got comments on that?
Yes. I think the important thing to think about with this is it's not about any one individual of us and our exact experience with transit and how we would or wouldn't take it. It's about sort of trying to get these changes on the margins, and just going back again to the research I did looking into this. Decades of research says you make the transit more frequent in the areas where people are already using it, you're going to get more people who are using it. And that's, focusing again on the biggest transit systems in the state is how you're going to accomplish that. As Eric said, it's not going to necessarily be a big jump in Alexandria. Like, you're going to get your biggest jump in New Orleans, in Baton Rouge and Shreveport, and just getting that level of service that people can rely on. So the bus is coming every 20 minutes, 3 buses an hour, as opposed to maybe every 30 minutes or every 45 minutes. That will create these changes, even if it's not going to be a change that necessarily any one individual on this call is going to make personally.
Just one last comment in reference to something that Eric said. The SportTrans system over the past 5-6 years has basically been revamped into some of those small circulator type route systems rather than the traditional hub and spoke. It's more of smaller neighborhood route systems that connect to each other, and then a few express routes from key areas. Within the urban area, that on-demand service is basically to provide some of that last mile connections from some of the neighborhoods to a route, and then they use the traditional route system from there. But it's changing those route systems to smaller circulator type routes rather than traditional hub and spoke has made a tremendous difference. And I think it does provide more frequency. Plus you get there a little quicker. You're not having to go from, Southwest Shreveport all the way into downtown to get back to Southwest Shreveport and things like that. So it's using those smaller circulator routes. You're also able to use some of the smaller buses, smaller vehicles, similar to like what the airport shuttle type services use too. So I think it's some mindset change in the operators too. And I think De Niro has done a great job in changing a lot of those mindsets in this region.
And if I can just add on to that, since I think De Niro was having the mic problems, from our conversation I had with De Niro, they did this network redesign in 2017, which also added for their major routes, not necessarily circulators, but just more buses on those routes. So when people got to them, there was less waiting, reduced travel time. De Niro said a year and a half later in 2019, after this redesign, they had their highest ridership in a decade.
Yep.
And this is a process that both RTA and Jefferson Transit in the New Orleans region have been looking at for the last 2 years. And RTA board just approved a similar style redesign in March, and they're working on the implementation of that right now. So that will also make it a lot easier for a lot of people to rely on this. Though, again, the funding does become critical for still getting the buses out on the streets.
Thanks for adding that, Alex. That was really helpful context. And Harriet raised a question in the chat on would micromobility such as e-bikes and also scooters be useful to connect people in transit, and would transit agencies be willing to bundle trips and integrate fares? Alex, that might be a question for you.
I can speak to Sportran. Every one of their vehicles is bicycle lift equipped. Even their small buses, I believe even a couple of their on-demand sedans even have some bike rack type things on the back of their vehicles. So they have gone. Again, it's just another one of those measures of going, trying to do everything we possibly can to make transit a usable service.
And to the e-bikes and maybe bike shares specifically, New Orleans had a bike share that Uber had bought out, and then when Uber sort of had to drastically reduce operations at the beginning of the pandemic, that got phased out, but it's now being brought back locally. I'm sorry if you can hear the whimpering dog in the background. It's now being brought back locally, and it'll be back in September. So I think there's a lot of potential there in RTA, and I don't know if Flozell Daniels is with us currently, but he might be able to address this further, is looking at a sort of overhaul of some of their fare systems and trying to combine a number of pieces. So I think there may well be some room for potential there, to Harriet's question.
Question. So members, I'll move us along to this other component on the slide of enhanced land use planning, but just to make sure, have the main components down on public transit. So we need to focus on better utilizing those federal funds, working through some of those turf wars, and then better understanding this on-demand rural transit, these circular systems instead of hub and spoke, and working through those systems in particular alongside the funding and then the agency relationships as well. Does that encompass well the thoughts raised? Great. So moving along to enhance land use planning, which I see as pretty integrated with public transit, there were two actions on creating a state framework that guides our land use practices and manages our land use. And then one also by a similar group, this is from the Land Use Building and Housing Committee, on linking land use and transportation planning for compact development. And then Jessica put forward two proposals on expanding implementation of complete streets and reducing vehicle miles traveled. So Jessica, if you are with us on the call, it would be great to hear more about these actions that you put forward, and maybe we can think a little bit through how do we integrate the land use and transportation components.
Sure, I'm here, Lindsay. I guess I should have had that in front of me, but I think that the two main things is to, for complete streets, is to reduce those short trips that I can't remember what the statistic is, but there's just this large number of very short trips that could be shifted over to other modes if the infrastructure was available. And I think we have a lot of opportunity there, and New Orleans is doing a great job of kind of leading the way on that. And for the vehicle miles traveled, I think that's more of a planning, a regional planning issue. And I think that gets back to the coordinating land use and transportation, so that we are not increasing the number of people that are living a long distance away from where they live, or from where they work, where they go to school, or just their daily destinations. If we can be more focused on reducing those distances just in the way that we manage our development patterns, that would be another. And that both of those have so many co-benefits that are integral to addressing equity and increasing quality of life and improving public health. I feel like those are strong players for a strategy going forward.
Those are very important actions to raise, as they do fit well in that land use and transportation planning. Harriet mentioned a really interesting statistic in the chat that over 50% of all trips in the US are less than 3 miles, and 73% of those are now taken by car, which is an incredible amount of our transportation. So Jessica, that really is true. So members, I'm curious if this, and you guys would know better than I do, does this come from the MPOs? Does this come from, Alex, as you were just speaking to, more local and municipal planning? Is this at the state level? Where can we start to operationalize or start to plan better here? It sounds like some of those efforts are already underway.
I will say one thing, this is treacherous ground to be on. Right now, local governments, not MPOs, I mean local governments, parishes and municipalities, call the shots on land use. And they're very adamant about doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of this has to do with, I think, promoting the benefits of doing better planning. And I know CPEX does that. We do that. Our department does that because a lot of these bad land use decisions causes all kinds of problems on the transportation system that we have to fight with then. And so it's definitely an area that we need to convince local governments that, a lot of local governments in Louisiana don't even have zoning.
Mm-hmm.
They equate zoning with communism.
Right.
So, and just convince, personally, I wouldn't live in a place that didn't have zoning,
Right.
but, a lot of local governments, that's the way they think. And so that transition is going to be very difficult. And I think has a lot to do with education and maybe opportunities for the carrot rather than the stick to try to lead them to do plans. We're working on a planning idea for mostly small rural governments to try to get them to at least think about the future. And if you don't have a plan, something's going to happen over the next 30 years, whether you have a plan or not.
Right.
The question is, are you going to be happy with what the outcome 30 years from now if you don't have a plan?
Right.
So that's what we're trying to get people to do, is something's going to happen. So you can either kind of try to guide that and manage it or just let it go on its own. But you're going to wind up with an outcome 30 years from now. And are you going to be happy with it or not? And that's the whole question.
Well, and as I move to recognize some of the raised hands, I think, Eric, you're right. I would though argue it won't be 30 years. It's happening as we speak. If you look at the flooding, if you look at some of the other things that are impacting us, a lot of that has to do with what you pointed out, very localized and disparate decisions. And I think this is not a set of recommendations to force them, but I do think there are some incentives that can be put in place that really bring people along in this way. I'm going to go Harriet and then Alex and then Kent. And I will ask, because we have so much work to get through and only about an hour and a half left, that we keep our thoughts as concise and complete as possible. Harriet, we'll start with you.
Just a couple things really quick. To Eric's points, you're proposing to spend state money, right? And that you are spending state money with some policy objectives in mind. At the end of this whole process, those objectives are going to include reducing the amount of carbon that's emitted, right? It might include increasing jobs, but that it's totally reasonable for the federal government, for states, as the money flows down, to think about how you allocate that money and how you ask for and prioritize funding places that are willing to align with your policies. That's not forcing anybody to do anything, but the more alignment, the more money, right? Or the higher the priority for funding. And alignment is getting the rules consistent, getting the plans consistent, but getting their budgets consistent. Because states, but localities are also spending their own capital budgets, sometimes to undermine the very things that you're talking about, right? So I think that's a totally reasonable thing to do. So I would just suggest start thinking about it that way, that you're going to spend state money. Some of it is going to be entirely undermined and counteracted by what locals are doing or not doing. And you're wanting alignment. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I was a state planning secretary in a more northern state, in Maryland. And we had a lot of localities, local governments that had no planning capacity. We ran a circuit rider program. We would detail people from the state offices to various smaller communities to help them put together a comprehensive plan, to help them make zoning changes. I think that, obviously the state of Louisiana does not have such an entity, but you do have CPECs. You could imagine a program where you could provide planning capacity, fund planning capacity. Maybe a state planning agency would be a great idea. But even without it, you could figure out ways to provide capacity to local governments, especially if those regulations, some of those plans are going to become future prerequisites to state funding.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Harriet. Alex Buzowski.
Yeah, reiterate everything Harriet just said about, sort of where is the leverage, and I wonder specifically, is there leverage for some of our larger projects and some of our anchor institutions on this? Flozell, a local example that just keeps coming to mind with me is Delgado's expansion to that West Bank Jefferson Parish campus. And I remember one of the first conversations I had with a Delgado rep about this. They were like, well, now we got to get transit service out there. And my jaw just dropped and hit the ground. I'm like, you're the community college putting out a new campus that could really, I think it was partially dealing with water economy and some of the ports, could really help people, but they have no way of getting there. And now you're looking for transit service, like sort of this sort of checklist ahead of time, especially when the state, I would imagine, has a lot of leverage for a project like that, I think could be incredibly helpful.
Absolutely. I think that's the case. Kent.
Yeah, I just want to comment on Eric's statement in terms of local land use and being careful. One of the issues we're facing here locally is that the Planning Commission in the Shreveport-Caddo area, there was recent state legislation passed to reduce their size, to reduce their jurisdiction, to take away the traditional 5-mile buffer around the area. And Caddo Parish is now looking at how do they deal with the zoning that was in original zoning and land use that was in that 5-mile buffer that will shortly no longer be in that 5-mile buffer. So there are some local land use issues out there in terms of jurisdiction and who can and can't do some things. So I know that there's other areas that are looking at some of the similar language to take away some of the jurisdictions from those local planning and zoning areas.
Thanks, Kent. I really appreciate that. And I just do want to punctuate everything that's been said by you all. One of the ways we see this at the Transit Authority in New Orleans, and I'm sure others around the state see it, is when those decisions get made outside of some cooperation and alignment, it really impairs our transit operation. It endangers our operators and it increases our costs when there's not this sort of alignment across land use and planning and zoning and housing decisions and a lot of the economic development decisions. And so there's some real opportunities there. Anybody else on this front and on this particular page before Lindsay moves us to the next?
It's De Niro Washington. I just wanted to apologize. I had technical difficulties, so I couldn't log in.
Okay.
Unmute, but I'm back on the call now and trying to drive to a better location because something happened in our main office. We don't have cellular signal anymore or Wi-Fi.
Well, thank you, De Niro. And I know this is such an important issue. Did you want to weigh in on any of this stuff now, or did you want to wait?
Alice, as me and Alex kind of talked as he was putting his presentation together, he took a lot of the recommendations that we had already discussed. And so Alice kind of took care of it. So I will just state that I think land use, as you were just stating, and public transit has to be able to work together. One of the things I think in our area that's working so well is that we're able to work with our MPC and on most of the new developments that were coming online to plan transit as a part of those entities. And I think that's going to have to be an important use in all transit throughout the state of Louisiana.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely the case. All right, Lindsay, let's move to the next slide. This is good stuff here. Promoting energy efficiency and reduced trips. Lots of good stuff here. Lindsay, was there anything in particular you wanted folk to check in on? Lots of good recommendations from Dr. Calavoda and his team.
It would be great to hear from Eric and Ann on the actions that they put forward here. And I just want to make sure we save some time on this slide to think through the medium and heavy duty vehicles. Are we missing a focus there? I saw Bethany's comment on the last slide about incorporating components of freight in freight planning. And so Bethany, we'd love to hear your thoughts on promoting efficiency there as well in this sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, I think Eric, maybe Ann, because I think Ann had to step away for a second. Eric, do you want to
Sure.
give us some of this?
Yeah. The first item up there that I worked on was the broadband access, and I was serving on the governor's task force on rural revitalization, and broadband expansion was a big part of that. But there are parts of urban areas that don't have good broadband service either. And so, you know, one of the transportation advantages of broadband access is it does allow for work from home. It allows for telemedicine. It allows for remote learning for people that can take classes online without having to actually travel to a institution for on-site education. And it allows shopping from home too, and home delivery. And so, you know, it has the potential to reduce vehicle trips. And so the best mile traveled is the mile that never gets traveled. And so somebody, maybe that was Ann that said that. I don't know. I don't plagiarize somebody's statement, but nevertheless, it's and there's a lot of talk at the federal level about that need to expand broadband. Well, that can help us with our greenhouse gas emissions as well by doing that. And we're looking at how we can allow those lines inside state highway right-of-way to help reduce the cost of providing that expanded broadband access. Second thing is we already have a program that we've had underway for years about trying to work through the metropolitan planning organizations to work with employers to set up employer-based carpooling and talking to them about telecommuting, and can they allow their workers to compress their work weeks, maybe work 4 10s instead of 5 8s, and therefore eliminate 1 day of commuting and things like that. It really wasn't done for greenhouse gas reduction. It was really done for reducing ozone, the potential for ozone pollution, and also to help deal with congestion. But it applies to greenhouse gas as well. And so we certainly want to continue that program, maybe expand it. But it does require people through the MPOs, again, we work through them to go out and actually work directly with major employers to try to get them to institute programs. And you know, that's the one way you can have an immediate impact on greenhouse gases without any government action or anything else. Make the commitment to carpool with somebody starting next week, and it'll save you money over the time, and you know, and it'll have a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But we do have a number of congestion reduction programs. We're monitoring all of the freeways, for example, all the time, so that if there is an incident there, a wreck or a truck spill or a vehicle breakdown or something like that, we can advise people through electronic messaging. We can also dispatch a wrecker or an ambulance or a fire truck or what have you to try to get that incident addressed and cleared. And we're very cognizant of programs through our work zones. For example, we have to do lane closures and things like that. That can have a lot of congestion effects, which produces a lot of idling and has negative air quality impacts. And so we want to continue those programs. We're also, as some people may know, we're replacing signalized intersections with roundabouts in a number of areas, and that has a positive air quality benefit as well. And then lastly, there are programs. I mean, government buys equipment and vehicles, and we need to review what our specifications are on energy efficiency for all that we do, and maybe tighten that up. We don't want to tighten it so much that you reduce competition, but we do want to continually tighten those energy efficiency requirements under that cliche that we were all taught as kids, waste not, want not. We ought to be conserving energy irrespective of climate change. We ought to be just conserving no matter what. And so we need to keep after that. We're currently converting a lot of our lighting and traffic signals over to LED as opposed to the previous technology, because it's much more energy efficient and requires less maintenance too, which is also a benefit. But so those are the kind of things that I worked on under this. And I know Ann wrote the idle reduction incentives for state fleets. That idling of vehicles, particularly heavy trucks, there's a lot of wasted fuel and a lot of pollution that's produced just in idling. And so if we can reduce that idling, that's a big benefit.
Yeah, I think that's right, Eric. And it looks like Ann is back. Ann, do you want to share with us some of the ways you were thinking about those incentives?
Well, with idle reduction, there's a lot of things that can be done. It also can be done on a municipal level with zones where there's no idling allowed, or schools can have no idling policies and set up things for bus drivers. So of course, a lot of our school buses don't have air conditioning, and the bus drivers are going to want to run the air conditioner. If you set up a room where the bus drivers can sit that's air conditioned while they wait for the students, or there's other things that can be done. So there's things that can be created on small levels with a school or a municipality, and make it a ticketable offense if you are sitting in your car idling, or you leave your car running when you're not driving it for a certain amount of time. There's also onboard technologies that can be installed in fleet vehicles that will automatically shut the vehicle off after idling for 5 minutes. There's also onboard things that, say, like a police car can put on, that will keep the car ready and keep everything operating while they're sitting on their long, maybe they're on a stakeout or they're just sitting roadside and they have to be able to take off quickly. There's things that you can put in the vehicle. Of course, that's all irrelevant if you have an electric vehicle, because then that doesn't matter. You can sit all day long and you're not going to be emitting any emissions. But so there's lots of different things that can be done on many different levels. And there's technology to support it as well, because we know the heat in the summer here, it gets ridiculous, and we want to keep our air conditioners running. So there are things that can be done, and some compromises that might need to be made. And a little bit of like Eric was talking about, we need to get back to that conservation mode of conservation being kind of more of a change in the way we think about things. It is the conservative thing to do, to conserve fuel and not to waste things. Money's not the only thing that's bad to waste. Resources are as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do want to highlight the point that Eric made also about the improvements in maintenance and maintenance cost reductions in a lot of these options. We've seen it firsthand at the RTA. We think that's a big selling point as well, to provide resources to expand transit in other ways. And Lindsay mentioned the wanting to have some specific conversation about the medium-sized trucks and the fleets. We know there's sort of an outsized impact from a GHG perspective. And so is that a part of the idle reduction that you're talking about? Are there other things we should be looking at to have a bigger impact on those medium-sized trucks?
The automatic shutoffs with idle reduction, the onboard systems that help to keep things running. If you have a refrigerated unit, you're going to have to be able to keep that refrigerated. You want your ice cream. We don't want our ice cream to melt if the truck has to stop and park somewhere for a little while. So there are technologies in existence already that will keep that going without emissions. So there's going to need to be incentives for fleets to do this.
Yeah.
A lot of fleets, like the state fleets, have telematics already installed, and telematics on fleet vehicles can really help a fleet manager understand what they're doing. They can see where their people are idling, and they can institute idling, no idling policies. So there's some things that can be done also just with some management and some training with telematics that doesn't even require new technologies on board.
Okay.
So yeah, definitely. We look at our, even like Republic Services, they have idle reduction and automatic shut off on their vehicles, and they save so much money in fuel costs every single year by having these idle reduction policies and practices in their fleet. It's ridiculous how much money you save. So it's a good incentive for these medium and heavy duty fleets.
Great. And we see some other actions here that overlay with some of what Eric and Ann have mentioned. I wonder if there's any other points or questions about any of the rest of these actions from the committee. I actually do have a question. I'm not sure one of you can, I think I'm supposed to know this, but the Buy Clean Louisiana action here by Z Smith, what is that initiative exactly?
So is that from,
Go ahead, Lindsay.
yeah, from what I read on the Buy Clean policy is reducing carbon intensity of construction and attracting low carbon industries, really focusing on the carbon intensity of construction materials. Eric, is that what you gathered as well?
Yeah, Eric had mentioned that was in there, and I just didn't connect the dots on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's something we can certainly look into, and I think it offers some potential in transportation infrastructure construction, particularly if we can encapsulate carbon dioxide in concrete.
Mm-hmm.
That could be beneficial, and we discussed that the other day, I think briefly, but you know, in pavements, that would be probably concrete pavements would be the way we would want to start that, because the long-term durability is always a question I have. Our current theoretical design life of the bridges we build is 75 years, which means they'll probably be there for 80 to 100 years. So anytime we're going to change any composition of concrete, we need to know what that long-term impact is on the durability of the concrete. But for pavements, it's less of an issue, because, you know, if pavements start falling apart, yeah, there's a cost to that, but it's not going to be catastrophic. So there is some potential there, and we can certainly, I'm sure there's been a lot of research on there. There'll be a lot more.
And when it comes to the state fleet, there's going to need to be a lot of education. I think for the middle management, fleet managers within all the different departments and some of the operators, we have a telematics system in existence for the state fleet, and they can be a little overwhelming at times because there's so much information in there and so many things they can do with that information that some people just use it just for the basics, and they're really rich. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do to help educate all the different levels of the state fleet to make them more comfortable accepting new policies and then using these technologies that we already pay for and we already have that can help them save a lot of fuel in their fleets.
So, and you see the biggest hurdle in that is just adopting those telematics and educating
with the state fleet, yeah, because we have the telematics, we have the tools in existence to do this. It's just getting the drivers and the fleet managers and the different departments in the middle and lower levels, the people actually working with the vehicles on a daily basis, and the people who manage the telematics systems, getting them more training and kind of pushing them to use these features, not just training them to use it, but having some pressure from their bosses pushing down saying, I want these reports, I want you tracking these things. And like I said, to me, it's one of the quickest and easiest ways and the most low cost ways for us to start saving money and just stop wasting fuel.
Fantastic. One of
Low hanging fruit.
Well, one of the things that came up in the conversation last time as well, that's not explicitly put here, but I think is implied, is the tremendous opportunity we have from a tech transfer and applied research perspective in the state. I know we already have such amazing partners at LSU and Water Institute and other places, but really thinking about over the mid to long term, what are the kind of technologies that we can potentially produce here in Louisiana that also accrue to not only significant reductions in GHG emissions, but the creation of businesses and jobs and opportunities for Louisiana's people, so we can do good by doing good.
Absolutely.
Anything else on this point? Promote energy efficiency and reduce trips before we move on to the next set of action steps.
Lizelle, I wanted to bring attention to this last action, more focused on freight, low carbon mode shift. So Dr. Barnes had put forward the idea of we should identify emissions that are produced via shipping, by shipping via truck, rail, water, and air, and then incentivize the use of the mode that produces the least emissions. And so I was curious, particularly Bethany, if you're with us on this call, I know you've done a lot of research in this area and work in freight, and so I'm curious what perspective you might bring to that.
Sure, but my neighbor is power washing, so if that gets really loud, I'll come back to you. Yeah, so there's freight shipping is fundamentally different and has to be planned for different than passenger because all the modes are privately owned and function differently. And getting mode shift is a supply chain question. So you really have to work with your freight forwarders, logistics providers. Mostly it's all about reliability. So freight shipments, generally, it doesn't matter how long it takes, with obviously some exceptions, but that it needs to be there when it's supposed to be there. And so the maritime industry right now is moving based on IMO regulations to change their fuel source, because basically what they were burning is just shy of asphalt. It's just gross stuff. And so there's a plan to work on that and to try and clean up that industry some. And the concept that we can move more containers by barge than by truck is true, but it also has to be along the supply chain that works for. So it's not as easy to do modal shifts in freight because there's so many actors involved. It's not convincing one or two or three people to consider biking or walking instead of taking a short trip. But there is a lot that can be done to incentivize what is produced. So for example, decreasing wait time. If you're a cleaner burning fuel, then you can move to the front of the line and you don't have to wait. And so particularly for both the maritime industry and the trucking industry, right there, that's all based on times and turns. And so if they can get into a position sooner, or they can get in around a scheduled, they don't have to have a scheduled appointment. They can just come when they are. So there's ways to incentivize them. And like I said, the port has the clean truck program that will help pay for them to replace their vehicles so we can get newer, cleaner burning trucks moving things. I think the real challenge is going to be in urban areas, shifting freight movements. And I did put this in the chat, from traditional larger sizer vehicles, UPS and FedEx vehicles, and finding areas and corridors that really can advance new technology with robot and drone delivery and incentivizing that kind of work. And then more urban storage instead of large logistic warehouses that are moving things so far. So if you can build up instead of out with your urban supply chain, and then you're doing short trips with robot delivery, and that takes there's a real opportunity there for passenger transportation and active transportation to work more closely with freight transportation, because obviously in the past, maritime and pedestrians didn't have a lot in common. But if you got to have robots walking through these sidewalks or rolling on these sidewalks, then you have to have high quality sidewalks. So there's a lot of opportunity to incorporate more freight than we usually do in transportation planning. We've gotten better in the last decade than we had before. But modal shifts, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's difficult, and it's going to be very industry specific.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really helpful perspective. Anne, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to share on that?
Oh, I was just completely agreeing that about the industry specific comment. There's not going to be one silver bullet that's going to help across the board. We're going to have to be really open-minded at looking at the way each of these businesses and sectors operate when we're suggesting solutions, because something that works, you know, for transit may not work for freight, or may not work for on land freight, or it may work, you know, so and it may work differently in a urban area than it does in a rural area. So we can kind of idle reduction and think in VMT reductions, that's something that works across the board, I definitely believe. But it is something we do need to keep in mind as we're getting really specific and starting to narrow down solutions.
Anything else, Lindsay, on that front?
That's very helpful perspective. Just to make sure I'm capturing the discussion on this slide well, and you summed up really well that when we're thinking about idle reduction, we can look pretty similarly across the board. But as we think through more on other terms of efficiency, then we need to consider modes individually as they might relate to different stakeholders and industries. So I'll move us forward to the next slide if there are no further thoughts on this one. I think this is another great place where we can park in this group on increased alternative fuels and EV charging infrastructure and availability. There were a lot of great actions that you all put forward on availability of alternative fuels and what does that mean for diesel and gas powered vehicles, and some different types of fuels were put forward. So I'm curious from you guys, and Anne, it looks like you have had a lot of expertise and research in this field, as well as Scott from the aviation perspective. What alternative fuels do you see could be used where, and how do we start to break this down a little bit?
Okay, well, in each use case, there are different fuels with technology as it currently exists, with the vehicles as they currently exist. You know, like say, for example, propane is showing to be one of the best options for school buses. It reduces a lot of NOx, maybe not as much CO2, but you know, NOx is still pretty important. And the school districts in Louisiana, they don't have a lot of money. There's some of them are so broke they can't even afford to buy new diesels, which are the cheapest of all. And sometimes when we come to them with funding opportunities, like with the Volkswagen settlement and such, when we worked with DEQ, some of them had to turn it down because they couldn't even afford the discounted prices for some of these vehicles. So it's when we start looking at wanting long-term to move to say electric school buses, which right now they're extremely expensive and their ranges aren't very good, but that will change. You know, we know this with almost every new technology. The prices are going to come down. The early adopters that have a lot of money are going to bring that cost down for us. So it's going to be, again, a case-by-case basis. Right now, natural gas and renewable natural gas, which comes from landfill gas, so it's not a petroleum-based gas. It comes from decaying organic matter. Those are going to be great bridge fuels for trucking and heavy duty and long haul. The refuse industry loves natural gas because they can get renewable natural gas from the landfill, or they can get natural gas from the pipeline and use that in their trash trucks. And it saves a ton of CO2 for them as well. And when we start trying to move to electric, which I know a lot of people really just want to do that right now, we have to wait for the technologies to catch up, the prices to come down, and the ranges to extend on some vehicles. In urban areas, the electric refuse trucks are starting to work really well, but you need to have a nice compact route. The trucks are great because they're quiet. Like imagine my brother lives, in the city in New Orleans, and when the trash truck comes through in the morning, it wakes him up. And these smaller electric refuse trucks, they're going to be quieter. They're going to fit in the narrow roads in the urban areas, and they work for shorter routes. Like, again, this is a case-by-case basis, but we really need to look at the way the vehicle is used, where it is used, how many miles it's driven each day, how much fuel they use, because the return on investment is very important as well. And we have to look at that to make sure that we're not making a suggestion for a fleet and saying you should go this direction for this particular fuel, and the return on investment be ridiculous for them because the infrastructure may not be in place, or the fuel prices might be high, or the maintenance might be higher for that particular one. And, we're seeing more and more that we will be moving to electric and hydrogen fuel cells for the long haul trucking, but we do need to think creatively in this bridge period with renewable fuels, biofuels. That is a great way to get maybe school buses cleaner until we can get them in a propane or electric school bus, get them using biodiesel or renewable diesel. Renewable diesel is just a more highly refined biodiesel that is chemically the same thing as diesel, so they don't have to make any changes. It's just more highly refined. And there's things we're going to have to do to get these fuels more accessible, like biodiesel and renewable diesel. If you read our thing, it's kind of complex. Right now, the producers send the fuel to California or other places where they can make more money, where there's a renewable fuel standard. And the cost of the fuel to buy it here, when they produce it here, is more than people in California where the fuel had to be shipped there. So a fleet is less likely to want to use it. So again, I don't know, we can drill down on each individual type of thing, but Eric and I worked really hard on the availability of alternative fuels and getting the fuels out to the public as far as fueling stations. I don't know. I don't want to keep on talking. I want you give me a little bit more specifics and we can drill down, because I could unfortunately go on forever.
No, I think that's exactly what we need to hear. And so thank you for that. Are you comfortable, and others may want to chime in here as well, that the ways that we'll be measuring GHG emissions and to figure out where our biggest bang for the buck across the continuum of alternative fuels and electrification, will we be able to see clearly where the kind of return on investment and impacts are from that perspective?
Absolutely. The tool that we use is AFLEET, and it is developed by the Department of Energy using EPA standards, using GREET model and such. And you can go into the back end of AFLEET and you can change the assumptions, because this is a tool that was made for the whole country. And you can go in and change your energy mix. You can change the prices of fuels for the different fuels. So if you're comparing, you can do total cost of ownership comparisons between two different types of vehicles and their types of fuels. Well, one type of vehicle and two different types of fuels. You got to keep your variables consistent. And you can go in and you can re-enter those instead of using national averages. And so it's a tool that, Tyler, my co-coordinator, is really adept at, and he actually trains coalitions across the country how to use it. It's a fantastic tool. So that's what we use. And we also have our annual report that is coming out with our fleets that report to us voluntarily for the Louisiana Clean Fuels Territory. And we'll be able to show you the greenhouse gas emission reductions of the fleets that report to us from 2020 and from the last 10 years as well.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I see Dr. Bethany has mentioned the ferry systems. It's another good option for alternative fuels as we're looking at that. And Harriet's made a point here also about the economic development opportunities to potentially attract industry that's creating, whether it's more industry rather around alternative fuels and electrification as well. Any other particular points you wanted to pull out here, Lindsay, or anything else, Eric, from your perspective on some of that?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point for everybody's thinking. With our idea of increasing the availability of alternative fuels, to get them out to the public, we need to turn gas stations, quote, gas stations, into fuel stations where you have a bunch of different things. So it's electric recharging, different types of green or renewable fuels, renewable diesel, what have you. And so when we transition the public fleet, which I think we're going to talk about next, to the extent that we can, the tendency is, well, I'm going to have my own tanks or my own charging stations or whatever on my own space. To the extent that we can contract with the private sector to use these private fuel stations that are also open to the public, that will help incentivize the private sector to invest in that, because they'll have a base of customers coming from the public sector, and then they'll build a base of customers in the private sector. So that was kind of something that we all need to think about is, you know, to the extent that we can, if we can get the private sector to turn their gas station into a fuel station, we need to be their customers on the public side if we can to help build that base of support for them.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. And the fueling stations need that support. So if we want to open more natural gas fueling stations or DC fast charging stations, the people who are making those investments need to know that they're customers who are going to use them and how much are they going to use them, so they can make that justification to make that investment. And as a side note, the tax credits in the state of Louisiana for alternative fuels and for fueling stations are going away. They're going to either end in July or at the end of this year, depending on pending legislation. So this is something that, you know, if we want to incentivize this, this is some communication and education that we're going to need to do with our lawmakers, and to show them the economic benefits of this.
Yeah.
And you said these fuels are cost competitive. You think that if in the world where we were able to create those fuel stations, they would be cost competitive with traditional gas stations?
Most are. Right now I have people, a lot of gas stations are calling me wanting the DC fast chargers for electric vehicles, and they're wanting to try to find a way. Luckily, I'm applying for a grant, and hopefully if we win, I'll be able to fund corridor development on the I-49 corridor to because it's very much an underserved area for electrification, and we're going to try to build capacity along there. But without this kind of funding, it's quite expensive for them to install. But in Louisiana, and mostly in Baton Rouge, electricity is the cheapest in the nation. So fleets are going to save money on maintenance and fuel costs if they switch to electric. So it blows everything else out of the water as far as fuel costs. Natural gas is very competitive and cheaper. Propane, depending on the contract that you make with your propane provider, it can still also usually be cheaper than diesel. So you just need to be smart with your negotiations with your propane distributor. But like East Baton Rouge School District, they're moving to propane school buses, and they're saving a lot of money on fuel and on maintenance. So it's very competitive. Renewable natural gas and some of the biofuels, that's where the work needs to be done to get those more competitive and bring the cost down. And again, the renewable fuel standards may be an option for that.
Great. And looks like Kent, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just had a question for Ann. The alternative fuel stations that you're speaking of along the I-49 corridor, would those be placed at traditional gas stations, or would those be something that the state or the government puts in place? And the reason I'm asking is Bossier City owns and operates several alternative fuel stations around town. There's rarely anybody at them, even though the E85 fuel is like 90 cents cheaper than regular gas. There's CNG there. There's, one of them has several different alternatives, and there's nobody ever there because I think the general public thinks that's only there for, the Bossier City employees or the Bossier City fleet type things. It's wide open to the public and nobody uses them.
Well, that's something we can do with Louisiana Clean Fuels, is to help you find more fleets to fuel up there and help promote the locations and stuff. So a lot of that is awareness and education. But what we're looking at doing with the grant proposal, we're just proposing this at this point. It's for building communities. So there will be some, and this one, the grant that we're doing, it's just for electric. Because that's what the Department of Energy is asking for right now. It will be at fueling stations. It'll be at recreation areas. It'll be in multi-unit dwellings, because we want to expand access to charging to those who may not have a garage, and expand access. It's a kind of equity issue. And we're also wanting to try to find ways to get more on-street charging for those, say like in New Orleans, where you live on a street, you don't have a garage, but you want to have an electric car. You may not even have a driveway to where you can pull into the side of your house. You're parking on street. There needs to be ways for those individuals to be able to charge at home too. So that's kind of what our grant is looking at, is like building capacity within a specific community. But expanding the awareness of the existing fueling stations that we have, it's very important. We track the sales of natural gas in a lot of those Bossier fueling stations. I know Ivan Smith at their Freedom Fuel, they had a really good year, but I haven't been able to get some really good data out of Bossier for a little while. Perhaps you could help me with that.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, I think that I'll have to ask Tyler how we did with the annual report data collection on some of the stations up there.
Yeah, but I definitely agree with Eric's comment that we need to change them from gas stations to fuel stations, whatever that fuel is, whatever that energy is that needs to operate your vehicle. It's got to be available at all the different stations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
We'll want to come back and look at what some of those federal incentives look like to see if we can do some alignment, as Harriet was suggesting. Dr. Gopu.
And I have a question. How does your program connect with the various charging networks that are out there? You know, you have this EV Go, EV Connect, and Charge Point. There's numerous charging networks. How does your program connect or link with all these different networks? There are so many.
Yeah, luckily, most of the stations in Louisiana that we're getting, if they're Charge Point, so Charge Point does share data with us on the kilowatts used at their station, so we get that data. And again, the data we collect, it's voluntary, so no one is required to send this information to us. The utilities work with us as well to try to let us know, you know, if there's a major player in the area, and try to connect us with them so we can get the data on the usage as well. But, you know, that's an ongoing issue. And if anybody's out there listening and they have charging stations and they're not Charge Point, we would love to, you know, get a relationship with you all and start collecting your usage data, because it really is, we need to get as many people participating in our annual report as possible so that the data is more valuable to the state.
So your program, does it offer free charging, or is it based on a specific cost?
Well, Louisiana Clean Fuels, we're a nonprofit. And if you're talking about the grant that we're applying for to get the chargers installed, or because we don't own any chargers, we just collect data from other people and to share the impacts of alternative fuels as far as our annual report. So maybe, can you clarify?
Thank you.
Oh, okay. And well, other people, the way they charge, it's on an individual basis. So say if I'm, you know, there's a charger at the Cracker Barrel, they can choose to give it away for free, which a lot do when it's a level 2 charger, because it's pennies. It doesn't really cost a lot as a service to provide, but the DC fast charging and anything, we cannot charge by kilowatt hour in the state of Louisiana. It's a Public Service Commission issue. Only a utility can charge directly for the amount of electricity used, but you can charge for the time that someone is there. So it's kind of personal choice by the owner of the station. So when we do DC fast chargers, they will need to charge, but they will do it on a time model, and they can work with the utility to figure out a rate for the amount of time that someone is charging to make it to where they won't lose money.
Yeah.
I hope that helps.
And does that count for, or anyone? I'm just thinking about public agencies that might want to have not only their own charging stations, but might want to offer that as a service to the surrounding public, for instance. Are there prohibitions against that, or is that something we need to work out from a regulatory perspective?
You can give away like to charging away for free easily. I don't know of any other prohibitions other than you can't charge for the amount of electricity. We have chargers in state garages now that, you know, are open to whoever works for, like at the LaSalle garage, we have chargers at the top that right now are free to use. And the other garage down by the market, if you pay to get in, you know, you got to pay to park down there because they have public access, and anyone can use it for free. And those are level 2 chargers. Again, that's not costing the state much at all. But workplace charging is a great way to incentivize electric vehicle use. The last statistic that we've seen from the Department of Energy, that it increases EV adoption by the people who work in that business by 20%. So if you have chargers at your office, you're 20% more likely to go out and buy an electric car.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about those medium-sized trucks and fleets, and if they're going about their business during the day, are there ways for them to constantly have access, including public sector options?
Most fleets, when they purchase an electric vehicle, if they're medium duty, they're going to know the length of their route. They're going to have chargers on their own lot, and they're going to plan their routes and plan the usage of those particular vehicles around the range of the vehicle. It helps to extend the range of those vehicles and extends the use if we have public fast charging in the areas. So we like to coordinate with those fleets to try to help co-locate other chargers around town that are publicly accessible. And it just really helps them get that kind of little extra sense of relief, knowing that there are other chargers out there. So that's one of the things that requires a lot of coordination, and working with a Clean Cities Coalition like ours. There's Clean Cities Coalitions all over the country. So this is a model that works really well, making sure the public and private entities work together and coordinate for charging planning and infrastructure.
Yeah, Dr. Calavota.
Yeah, thank you. And just before we leave this topic, I did want to point out something that, aviation, and Scott wrote up a proposal about renewable energy and sustainable aviation fuel. If you'll recall from the 2005 inventory, aviation is 12% of our GHG that comes from transportation in the state. So it is a big deal. And that's kind of important that we start moving over to green fuels in the aviation sector. And I would point out the same thing in the port sector, and that was actually part of the write-up that Ann and I did on alternative fuels, that extended over into public ports as well, that we need on shore power available so that we reduce the idling of ships and tugboats and things like that at the ports while they're moored there, but also that some of the tugs, which are probably operating off diesel right now, could switch over to a green fuel, a green diesel, and if that's available to them. And so that would require some public investment, which we could probably do through our port priority program. If we can get a little additional funding for that, we could make that available to ports that wanted to provide green fuels at their facilities.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts on increasing alternative fuel and electric vehicle charging availability? We had a lot of excellent actions recommended here. And are there any questions or concerns?
I recall a big focus in our March meeting was on equitable siting of EV infrastructure. And I just want to make sure we're not missing that in this conversation. So there were a few actions put forward around EV infrastructure. The St. Tammany Mitigation Action Plan, I thought was really interesting because they wanted to increase their EV charging stations by 10 to 20% and convert 10 to 25% of their parish vehicles to electric vehicles in a 5-year time. I like having that quantifiable measure. I thought that was a great idea, but just was curious from you all if we're missing anything around those components of equity and around EV siting. Ann and Eric, I see your hands.
Eric, why don't you go first?
Well, I think his hand may have been up from the last.
Oh, okay.
Point.
Well, we're actually been applying for funding specifically to address those issues. One, we have applied for funding, non-federal funding, and we haven't heard back yet if we won. We want to put chargers into areas that normally don't have access to chargers. So it's all about equity and siting of those. We also want to site chargers at public recreation areas where, like state parks and such, that reaches a lot of people and goes into a lot of communities that traditionally don't have any charging. So that's something that we are working very strongly with. And this new administration with the Department of Energy, again, Louisiana Clean Fuels is an independent nonprofit, but we're part of a Department of Energy program called Clean Cities. And so we receive funding from them, and we get our mission and our objectives from the Department of Energy. And the huge focus right now is equitable access, and making sure that we're citing these things. So there is a nationwide effort with Clean Cities coalitions all across the country to do just this. And that Department of Energy grant that I've been mentioning about I-49, that is a key feature of that, where we will be working with community groups and to trying to make sure that we are citing these things, not just at, you know, the nice shopping malls and the expensive parts of town or the highly traveled areas, but we're getting to important parts of town that the people in the community need.
Yeah.
That is very, very important, and something that we are working on. We may not have put it in one of these action templates, but us as an organization are, you know, I'll be forming if we win the grant, we'll be forming a committee to ensure that everything that we do and install with the grant funding ensures that things are placed equitably within the community.
Great, thank you for that, Anne.
That's wonderful to hear, Anne.
Yeah, wish us luck. Keep your fingers crossed for us, because we're applying for a lot of funding right now to try to really get a lot of projects in Louisiana.
Yeah, and my understanding in the federal incentives that are being developed, there's going to be baked in some requirements similar to HUD funding and CDBG, that those placements are in census tracts in places where there can be equitable access. I'm not sure what that looks like though yet. I haven't seen any of the guidances. All right.
It would be significant to ensure equity is incorporated into the siting, and then also availability of the alternative fuels. And next we'll move into the transition of vehicles, another important equity lens that we need to bring there. So if there are no further comments on this, we'll move on to our last big chunk of slides, or of actions on transitioning vehicles and public fleets. Surprisingly, there were a lot of really good actions around converting public fleets to electric, into alternative fuels, and zero emission vehicle requirements for state vehicles. But then looking outside of that, Flozell and Asti put together a great recommendation on outreach and education. I think this would be a great place for us to park for a minute. And Harry, if you could, I think this would be a great place to consider where the American Jobs Plan and some of those federal initiatives could fit in helping us make that transition.
I had just said that a couple of things have happened at the federal level, and I'm sure Anne is also very familiar with it, that there's an executive order for the electrification of all federal fleet vehicles, but the executive order actually extends to state and local fleets as well. Not clear what that authority is to say much about that, but it certainly creates opportunities potentially if there are federal facilities in the state of Louisiana to maybe do some joint planning or have some conversations about possibly sharing some of that charging infrastructure. And certainly to have conversations about maybe the heavy up that might have to happen in the grid to support federal charging could also potentially support state and local charging. The other thing is that the American Jobs Plan does not have funding associated with it at this point. It's a plan, it's not a bill. Different components are undoubtedly going to be taken up by members of Congress, but in this closely split houses of Congress, it may or may not become law. In the meantime, the federal government, where it has discretionary funding, seems to be hewing to the principles and the ideas represented in the American Jobs Plan to put out those discretionary funds to try to accomplish some of the same purposes. So it's basically not too early to think about how you would position, especially given this massive climate planning effort in all your state departments, to position to simultaneously reduce carbon, increase equity, and reduce disparities, while also spurring the economy. So those are the three things that the American Jobs Plan is trying to do. So that, I mean, in a nutshell, that's what I think is worth thinking about now, and that the timing of this effort is very good with respect to that repositioning of state agencies.
Yeah. And Harriet, we did a webinar, the RTA did a webinar with the acting admin of FTA and one of the policy folks from the Department of Transportation. And there seemed to be some indication that even with the tough political environment, I think, as you put it, that we are certain to see, whether it's on the infrastructure side and some of the rulemaking, some incentives and a really different kind of authorizing environment to support these things. Do you think that's going to be the case? I mean, you've kind of been in the belly of the beast before. What can we expect even in a worst case scenario?
So there's been some really interesting work done around messaging, and the support is really high as long as you're connecting it to jobs. And jobs and reducing pollution. Greenhouse gases, not so much with the Republicans, but pollution actually has wide support. So pollution reduction. So I think there are things messaging wise that we could be doing that would be really smart. But yes, I agree. There's a path forward where we could get a lot of bills passed in the Congress, a lot of funding. But in the meantime, certainly with rules and with discretionary money that the federal government already has, they are going to be trying to implement those ideas. And honestly, I'm really trying to encourage, in my various roles, the federal government to look for matches from state and local funds. That alignment we're talking about, getting recipients of those funds to move their own money into these priority areas as well in order to qualify for these grants.
It's an important point about the pollution. I know our equity advisory group and really others on this committee have been also thinking about pollution as a part of this, separate and apart from GHG emissions, but the way real people live and experience some of the impacts of climate change and what it's doing in their communities. So thank you for that, Harriet. And I'll just mention, Lindsay, to your earlier point, part of what Astay and I were thinking about with this also is something that was mentioned earlier, is the need to start to build a different set of narratives to educate and inform and to really create some space for especially local communities. To Eric's point earlier, really letting people know that there's a way to engage in this climate change conversation, and in particular, reduction of GHG emissions on the transportation side in ways that really deliver for their people, increase access to opportunities, both for jobs, but also for access to healthcare and education and other things. And we do believe there has to be a way of beginning to message the evidence of what the folks on this call and others are doing on a day-to-day basis to advance those interests.
Lozelle, where do you think where are those biggest gaps in communications? Where does that investment need to happen? And I thought a great focus of your proposal too is taking that step back and looking at implications on workforce, on healthcare, on ensuring that we're considering the whole pipeline. So I thought that was a great focus, but I'm curious where you see those communication gaps.
Yeah, I think it's across all of those areas, and the reflex that we have, all of us, to want to stay in our lane and sort of talk about what we have expertise in. I think increasingly what we're seeing on the committee and across some of the other committees is a need to cross a line with housing, with jobs, with the environmental concerns, the equity concerns, so that we can build narratives that are reflective of how people are actually living in community. I think some of the bigger gaps are in talking about rural and ex-urban transportation options that are going to help meet the standard. I think we are going to have to help people reimagine what it means to use public transit and support it. Some of the ways that Alex Pazorski and De Niro were mentioning earlier. And I also think we need to recognize, and everyone may not agree with this, I'm not sure we're doing a great job of surveying Louisianans about what they want from a transportation perspective in ways that would reduce GHG emissions. I think there's a bit more of an appetite to use public transit, to consider alternative fuels and electrification, and to look at some of these other options than we can tell. And we probably should do some work in surveying our public and really understanding. I know Ann does some of that and some others. I would want to see and understand at a deeper level, what do Louisianans think, and how can we ensure that the actions that we're recommending in this climate task force are going to be reflective of what people really want.
A really interesting point to raise there, Flozell, on reflecting the needs of communities. And I know you work a lot with communities as well as Jessica. I know she does as well, and De Niro and Ken. I'm curious if you guys, Alex, you as well, work on the community level, how we can reflect that more. Are we reflecting that well, even just in our conversation today and what has been put forward? How can we reflect those needs better? I know it's a loaded question.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a lot. I mean, from a public transit standpoint, just, off the top of my head, I think really relating public transit to what it accomplishes. So we mentioned, Flozell mentioned earlier, just the workforce need, which I think is incredibly important. And obviously, if you're trying to connect to regular folk, you don't say the workforce need, but trying to talk about people getting to jobs, how they use transit there, getting to grocery stores. Thinking on that sort of basic level of just going through your day-to-day life, I think is very important.
All right.
I do have one other just question or comment as far as public fleets, specifically as it relates to transit, just making sure to throw in there the potential danger of unintended consequences. If there's too much of a mandate for our public transit fleets to convert quickly, but not enough support in terms of maintenance or matching some of the slightly higher costs for vehicles. I don't know, De Niro, if you want to add anything to that. I know some of the conversations I've had with you and others, there's a concern just about existing skills level for maintenance staff at public transit, and just making sure that we're conscious and cognizant of that. We have to be deliberate in making sure that the staff has the skills to deal with the new vehicles, and we don't inadvertently put ourselves in a position where buses are breaking down all the time and sort of ruining a lot of the good potential effect of that.
Yeah, and I would say I wholeheartedly agree with you, De Niro. The other thing that I would add is we'll have to eventually look at state procurement rules. When procuring some of these AV and technology, as well as CNG, different type buses, I think there needs to be more flexibility than versus going with low bid. Sometimes low bid versus the technology that you're getting in the vehicles can be a hindrance in someone going forward. So overall, I think the discussion today has been very helpful in the right direction, but that'll be the only thing that I would really add is we're eventually one day we're going to start looking at procurement rules within the state for procuring these type vehicles.
Absolutely, I agree with De Niro on that. We come across that issue about in 2018. Louisiana Clean Fuels hosted a state fleet alternative fuels conference to help talk in cooperation with the procurement department. If a municipal entity or a state fleet wants to purchase or procure a vehicle, they go through the state bid process, and oftentimes there aren't vehicles on that list that are alternative fuel options. So there's some issues to make it easier for them to procure them, and especially with a lot of electric vehicles. They don't have dealerships in Louisiana. It's direct procurement. So perhaps, sorry. He needs to be called Zoom instead of Ginger. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, with direct procurement, there are some issues where people can't necessarily procure the vehicles that they want. Say if DNR wants to buy a vehicle to travel all over the state, and it's an electric vehicle, and they say at this time, say a Tesla was the best one because it has the best range. The Model 3 and the Model Y are affordable, and police fleets are actually buying them. So it's not like we're not talking about super expensive vehicles.
Right.
If they want to procure them, they can't because of the state rules around procuring vehicles and dealerships and such. So there's some work that may need to be done with direct procurement or other procurement options where we can, maybe an entity can purchase off of another state's bid list if they have the vehicles that, a fleet wants and needs. So yeah, there's a lot of work. I agree with De Niro 100%.
I'm glad that you all have raised those points, because a big question I had on this idea of transitioning vehicles in public fleet, or what are those steps that we can take to move in that direction? And some of them we're already taking, but how do we really actualize that change and that shift? So it sounds like we need to ensure that there are the skill levels to maintain for the maintenance of those vehicles as we convert. But it's something that you and I have talked about and that you just mentioned is on the procurement side, ensuring that there are available resources.
Yeah, working with the community college system, I know they've had a really hard year. I know we worked with BRCC a lot, which has the Automotive Technology Center over here in Baton Rouge that was supposed to, it's going to be the center for the state, the technology center for the state for training and turning out technicians. They've had a hard year because of COVID, and the funding really, they need the funding and the expertise and the pressure, saying that we need to start training more technicians in these technologies, because right now we're not, they haven't seen the need because they haven't felt the demand. But when I talk to fleets and, companies like Freightliner, the dealers, they are desperate for trained technicians in these technologies, and natural gas and electrics. They need more highly trained technicians. So there's a disconnect somewhere, but I know the way things are right now, I don't think BRCC can afford to start a whole new program. So we need to really partner and support and prop up our community college system to provide this training. I can help with grant funding occasionally, and we can bring people in to train the trainers. We can form partnerships with other community colleges. There's a fantastic one out of California that I have a good relationship with, because the director of the community college in California is also a Clean Cities coordinator. We're friends. She'd love to come down here and partner with us to train and get our community college system up and running. There's other community colleges in other states nearby that would love to come in and have already volunteered to help us. It's just there needs to be the political will, there needs to be the management will, and there needs to be the funding to do it.
Yeah. So, Lindsay, you asked what was missing, and it occurs to me from this conversation, we may need an action that more overtly includes what Ann just mentioned about supporting and sort of integrating some of these efforts with our institutions of higher education, and really thinking about something that I know Eric also said in an earlier meeting, making sure we had resources to support the training of maintenance staff and things of that nature. And, maybe it fits in another committee, but I really think it's an important transportation if we're going to reduce GHG emissions.
I would agree with that, Flozell. One thing you think about too, for those agencies that have their own mechanics, and our Department of Transportation does, and I know most of the transit agencies do, in some of our contracts where we purchase vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles, we can include in that contract a requirement that whoever gets that award has to train, say, 3 or 4 of our mechanics, even if they have to go out of state to be trained. That's just part of the contract. You've got to train 4 of our mechanics in how to maintain these vehicles.
Yeah.
Something like that. So we can do that. But I think having our own training programs in the state's kind of important. We don't want to be relying on out-of-state training.
Yeah.
For people.
And we may also want to have a cooperative approach. I know we just bought some electric vehicles at the RTA, and not that all agencies will buy the same vehicles, but if there's a way for us to cross-train other staff at other agencies, I'm sure that we could do some kind of CEA or something like that, so we can keep those kind of creative options in mind.
They're great points to raise and build on a lot of the conversation too that we talked about in March, that to make that transition actually happen, we do need the infrastructure, including the institutional knowledge to do so, and the buy-in on that side. So that's a great point to raise. Harriet, while we're talking about this, I'm curious if you could walk us through a few of those components of your electric school bus roadmap that you laid out. I think it's pretty integrated, some of the components that you laid out with the conversation we're having around the higher institution and making that career shifts.
Yeah, I wish it was open on my computer, which it isn't, but I guess what I would say about it is that, just in terms of full disclosure, my organization at the World Resources Institute got $30+ million from the Bezos Earth Fund to help create unstoppable momentum to electrify school buses. So we're really eager to work with states and localities who are moving in this direction. It's a 5-year grant that just started this year. So we're super interested. Because I've worked so much with Louisiana on disaster recovery issues, I know that the money, both for mitigation and for recovery, could be used to provide the purchase of electric school buses because of the emergency use as a source of power at critical facilities. It's I think I think it was Anne maybe who mentioned it earlier, that across the country the VW settlement money, so air pollution related enforcement settlements, are being used to support school bus purchases. Poor kids of color across the country are more likely to be riding school buses. Diesel school buses produce demonstrably poor air quality around and inside the school bus that affects the performance of kids in schools. So conventional pollution is a really important issue, and alleviating that and prioritizing those buses and those routes where respiratory illness is high makes total sense. It's also true that we don't know when, we can't be precise, but we know as a high likelihood that much of the entire transportation sector, not to mention other sectors of the economy, are going to electrify. So we know that there's a shortage of electricians and a shortage of electrical engineers, a shortage of a lot of categories of employment that are going to be needed during this transition, utility workers and others. So this is an area that it would make sense to be doing a lot more job training in, and to be seeking funds for job training, and maybe to integrate school bus electrification with some of those other programs that would stream students into the trades and into careers that involve this transformation. So there's more of it in my write-up, but there are multiple sources of funding. I think because Louisiana has, correct me if I'm wrong, very low electric utility rates, that the vehicle to grid may not be quite as much of a benefit as it is in other states, but that's another source of funding in some places. And part of it depends on the on the Public Utility Commission and how much it wants to encourage this as an overall shift toward electrification. So does that cover what you were hoping I'd cover, Lindsay?
That is incredibly helpful. I thought the point you raised about job training and career track transitioning is a key part of making this transition, and not just with vehicles, but ensuring that we have the pipeline of workers as well as the infrastructure and the grid technology to make that transition.
And just like other things, there are first mover advantages, right? So, you know, the demand is going to grow. Not everyone is thinking about it as comprehensively as you know, as Flozell and Eric are thinking about it when it comes to this transition.
Let me ask Lindsay, I see that it's 11:48 and I know I have a very hard 12 o'clock. And I also want to make sure that we have time for public comments in case there are any. So let me ask, and I know we need to get to the last set of actions here that I think Eric is going to walk us through. Do we have any emails or notes about public comment so far?
None that we have received so far. Okay. Eric, would you mind walking us just very high level through these actions you put forward? Yeah. And then
I'll be extremely quick. A lot of the first one through natural sequestration has to do with reforestation, and as everybody on our panel knows, there's something called the heat island effect in urban areas. Is simply because you have so many surfaces that absorb heat during the day and they radiate off that at night, that if we can increase the tree cover, you can cool the urban area. So that's a benefit to reforestation, in addition to the amount of carbon that can be sequestered in trees. And so there is the opportunity to reforest a lot of public property, including street right-of-ways and highway right-of-ways outside of the zone that you need to keep clear for safety purposes. But there's also things like blighted properties, which I think all the mayors would be very in favor of doing, because that's a big problem for mayors to deal with, is clearing blighted property. And then if you can clear that and reforest it, that helps with the urban tree canopy as well. But there's blighted properties in rural areas too that could be done, but there is an awful lot of public property that could, where we could increase the number of trees that are on there, and that would sequester some carbon and also help with that heat effect. The other option there, the other idea there is actual carbon capture and storage. There is equipment that can be purchased that can actually capture carbon out of the air, and you could locate some of those next to some really high volume transportation facilities like interstates, urban interstates and things like that, and actually capture carbon. There is a market for carbon dioxide, by the way, industrial applications for it, but I think a lot of it the intention is to store it, sequester it underground. And so from a transportation perspective, difficult to do on a vehicle by vehicle basis. So we need to do it on a broader area, or even gain offsets from other industries, the power generation industry or what have you, for capturing additional carbon to offset some of the transportation carbon emissions. So that's really the two write-ups there.
Great, thank you, Eric. And I put an article in the chat about these heat islands. There was just some coverage in New Orleans about it recently as an example of the opportunity. There's also a real sort of deep equity and affordability issue there, both in all kinds of communities across the state.
Yeah, a lot of low-income communities have less tree cover than more affluent communities, and so that increase. I would point out too, it's a good jobs training, a good jobs program, reforestation. They use that during the Great Depression with the WPA. They had these tree planting programs where they employed a lot of young people doing that, and so it's it doesn't require a lot of skills to plant trees and things like that. So I mean, it is a good youth employment programs we could have during the summertime for kids to work doing something that's highly beneficial.
Good deal. All right. Thank you, everyone. Unless there are any last minute comments or questions, we will turn this over to Lindsay to give us our next steps and what you expect going forward. Any last minute thoughts or comments, committee members? All right. So much gratitude for the tremendous amount of work that you guys put in to get these actions forth. Lindsay?
That sounds great. Thank you, everyone, for such a great discussion today. It's really helpful for me, and I hope for all of you guys, to learn more about these actions and really diving into the weeds of what needs to move forward. So I really appreciate that. And just wanted to frame in one slide real quick what the next steps are. As I mentioned, we'll meet again in mid-September to review strategies and actions after they've been evaluated and after they've gone through an initial review and look through by the task force this summer. So that's what we'll really be working towards. But I would just say homework moving forward is engaging in the task force, and the summertime meetings, they'll be working on some priority setting, but also looking at these actions in a high level. Flozell and Eric are both members on the task force and can keep you all updated on movement in that. And I would say from this meeting as well, I've made a lot of notes on follow-ups that I'll make with each of you as we dive more into some of these actions and trying to develop out what the strategies look like. So be on the lookout for any emails and material prep for the next meeting, and further from me on developing out these actions, and also from Eric and Flozell with the same. And that's all I have in terms of next steps. Chairs, if it's all right, we can move into public comment for a minute.
Yeah, please. And just by way of information, just to be sure, committee members, if there are any follow-up questions or points that you want to make sure to send Eric and I, along with Lindsay, emails so that we can keep track of those things, and also make sure that we're sort of representing and fighting for these perspectives inside the task force work.
We'd love to continue the conversations from today. So for those of you who are attending as a public participant on the webinar, if you have any comments to make, please raise your hand and I would be glad to let you in to the meeting. And I will also check our climate email just to make sure that I haven't missed anything there.
Wait, Lindsay, while you're checking that, if the public has follow-up questions or feedback, can they email at the climate email as well, or what would you recommend?
Absolutely. You can email it to climate@la.gov with any additional comments outside of this meeting time, and I'll make sure we get them to the right person if you have a question on specific follow-up with an action and anyone who wrote them. That's why we included the action developer name so that we can reach out and connect the right people. I see no hands raised, and I don't have any comments in our climate email. So chairs, with that, I will hand it back over to you.
Fantastic. Any last thoughts, or should we call for adjournment?
No, I just want to thank everybody again for participating today and for the action items that you submitted. I know it was a lot of work, and I think it was Harriet brought up earlier about not being able to fill in all the gaps. None of us could fill in all the gaps, so don't worry about that. We'll find a way to do that later. And some of that we need from the science advisory group anyway, because we just don't have the data to fill in everything that needed to be filled in. So don't worry about it. But thanks again, everybody. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. I share the same thanks. There's so much learning that's going on and sharing. I think we're going to really make our goals come true. All right, I will accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay, right. One second. I see no opposition. Thanks, everyone. Oh, Harriet, did you have one last thing to say, or was that your motion?
I just thought
Yeah.
No, I just thought there was such great material in the chat. I was going to ask if Lindsay could save the chat and send it to all of us so that we could review all these different articles at our leisure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me to do that, Harriet. I will send that out.
Good deal. That's a great idea. All right, everyone. This meeting is adjourned. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Have a great Friday.
Take care.